everyone. I'm Mike Cannici, and welcome to Valley Sports Rewind. Today we have back with us Steve Reilly. As you know, Steve joined us in the summer, and we talked about his first book that he wrote, The Fat Lady Never Sings, which came out in 2006. Well, here we are 10 years later, 2016, and he has wrote another book called The Lord of the Infield Flies. And Steve, it's an honor to have you on again, and I really appreciate you coming on.
Well, thanks for having me on. It's an honor to be here.
Steve, let me ask you this. I was just going over this a little bit. Seems like you started writing this in 2005, early 2005. So that's like 11 years of writing this book. How long did it take to write this book? And did you have issues with getting it published or anything like that?
Well, this book, I had ideas since I wrote the first one. I had ideas of what I might write a second one about. And after I wrote the first one, a lot of the players on the 1977 state championship team from Derby, who I had coached in the summer, were all asking me, why didn't I write a book about them? So I had it in my head for quite a while, but it was only until this past year that I actually decided I better get this done.
Right. Now let me ask you, how many hours a week would you say you worked on this book to, finally finish it, if you had to guess?
I would say probably about 15 hours a week.
Wow. So, you have a full-time job, you coach, stuff like that, and then you got to fit hours in to write this book. Let me ask you, I imagine it's a labor of love, but were there times where it does get a little frustrating and a little tedious to do?
Well, the tediousness of getting a book done really comes in after you write the first draft.
Right.
Because you write a draft, and then you have to have it edited.
Right.
And then you work with your editor, which is what I did, and then the editor comes back and tells you about all the things you did wrong.
Right.
And then you have to rewrite it and redo some of the things, and then the editor looks at it again and again, until you finally get to the product that you want. The difficulty is, believe it or not, is getting the physical book produced is where it gets kind of complicated, especially with formatting, where you think that you write a book, you get your manuscript in MS Word, as most of us write on.
Right.
And then you have to get that transformed into what most books look like.
Right.
For example, if you notice throughout the book, the cover is one thing, but the font of the cover is used on the inside cover, and that's usually something you see in all books.
Okay, right.
So I have to get the font to match the inside cover with the outside cover. Then on the inside, most books will say that you have to have no page number on the first chapter page.
Right.
And so then you have to get the formatting to work that way through these programs. And then once you get that done, then you can finally upload it to whoever you want to do the book, or whoever's going to print it, and so on. And printing is a whole nother ball game that you have to deal with.
Now, let me ask you, did you think it would take 10 years like it did? Did you plan on having it done sooner, or do you think that,
Well, there was an impetus to do it. Approximately a year ago, one of the players on the team that I'm writing about had passed away.
Right. So
at a young age of 55.
Right.
So.
Right. And I believe you're talking about Ed Wasikowska.
Wasikowski.
Or Wasikowska, I'm sorry, Wasikowska, who was a big-time pitcher for Derby on their 77 state championship team. Let me ask you this. Tell us what the book, it's definitely about the 1977 team, but more about the Babe Ruth team, correct?
Well, it's about the senior Babe Ruth team that I coached in 1977 in the summer.
Right.
But the majority of the players had played for Derby High. And in that particular summer, the majority of them were on the state championship team of 1977, which, in my opinion, hasn't really got as much ink, I guess, as they probably deserve. It was just such a great team.
Right. Now, before we talk more about this book, just give people an idea about the 77 team. What was that team like? Obviously, Waz was a great pitcher, but they had a lot of good players on that team that stepped up, and I believe they went 17-8, correct? Yeah.
No, that team got in the tournament with a 500 record, and I think they qualified on the last day.
Oh, really?
So they went in, I believe it was 9-9, if not 10-10, but I think it was 9-9. Back then, they only played 18 games in the regular season.
Right.
So they then got into the tournament and then made their way through it, ultimately beating St. Joe's in the final game at Quigley Stadium in '77. But the players on that team, it was unique. Wasikowska was a very, very unique pitcher and player. His hero was Mark the Bird Friedrich of the Detroit Tigers.
Yeah. He was an animal.
So he had a lot of quirky things that he did on the mound, and Waz was like that.
Right.
Waz's catcher was Pat McCormick,
right,
who, when Pat McCormick was also a stellar pitcher in his own right, and whenever Pat pitched, Ed caught, and whenever Ed pitched, Pat caught.
Right.
So then you had the first baseman was a very good player, but he didn't play on my summer team, was Gary Bisadecki.
Right, yeah.
And
he was very good.
And then you had Mike Stockman was the second baseman that year.
Yeah.
Bob Gabinelli was at short, and then at third base was Rick Lucarelli, who was another player who if you go back to that era, you can see how
he was only a sophomore then, correct?
He was a sophomore, and then he went on to do some very amazing things in Derby baseball himself. Left fielder was Gene Cirillo. Dave Nud DeRosa, another character, was the center fielder.
Right.
And George Russo was the right fielder. Now, the only ones who didn't play Senior Babe Ruth were Bisadecki and Russo. All the rest of them basically played.
Right. So, you're talking about a lot of characters. You mentioned Dave, the Nud, DeRosa. Now, he's quite the character in this book, and you mentioned him a lot. Just talk about, coaching that team that whole summer and because you were only, 20 years old, 21 maybe?
When I started coaching a team, it was 1976. I was 20.
Right.
And in 1977 of that team, I was only 21 years old.
Right. So, you're close in age with these guys, so that's not always easy to try to, number one, you got to not just coach them, you got to babysit them too, because, they're going to take advantage of you. It's just the way it works. But, talk about coaching that team and, I know there's plenty of stories, but just talk about, the first week of practice.
They were a challenge, to say the least, in 1977, but they were a great group of guys. They were a challenge, and that's part of the reason that I loved them so much. They would challenge you, but you never really got mad at any one of them because they would make you laugh. They were such characters, and they loved the game of baseball so much that you can just appreciate it sometimes.
Right.
But one of the things that complicated life for me back then was the fact that they had changed the drinking age to 18 years old from 21, which we were probably the reason why they changed it back.
Right. So talk about, this team obviously had a load of talent. Did it make it easy for you as a coach to coach these players, or was it, difficult? You were still kind of young coaching. Did you, you got to make sure you're handling the pitchers right, trying to keep everybody happy. And, it's a big...
Keeping, as far as handling pitchers, that was quite easy. We had a breadth of pitching, and back in those days, guys just wanted the ball. It wasn't you have to ask them if they wanted to pitch. They were like demanding to go in the game.
Right.
So they could have pitched the game before, and they would have been asking to pitch the next game. So really, it was just making sure that I didn't screw up.
Right. Which is not easy because again, you're young and you're going to make some mistakes. So, but let me ask you this. A lot of these guys had just won a championship. Did they feel like they knew more about the game than you, and you couldn't tell them anything because they had just come off this great run? Or
no, I don't think that was true. One of the things that they looked up to me for was I had played a little bit in college, so they were always asking me about the next level and what it takes to get to the next level and do well in the next level. So, and by the way, I forgot about the players that didn't play on the state championship team. Bill Schwab was my third baseman. Very, very talented athlete who didn't play baseball for Derby High because he was an avid golfer. He was an all-valley golfer.
Right.
And the guys tried to convince him to play for Derby High, but he just kept playing golf.
Right. So now I believe this is in chapter 4, Head into Maine. Talk about the Maine experience. Give us like a, good story that people, just like a little appetizer.
Well, I can tell you this, is that originally we were supposed to go to the Cape.
Oh, okay.
What happened was I had wanted to expand the horizons of these players, so to speak, and I was willing to play anybody, anywhere, anytime. So I was calling around New England trying to get a game and saying, hey, it would be nice to take kids out of state, perhaps.
Right.
Mistake number one. and then what happened was the Cape team couldn't make it. They had a game they had to play in their own league.
Right. So
they canceled out, and we ended up playing a team from the Saco, Maine area, actually, up there in southern Maine.
Right.
They were willing to play us in a doubleheader, one game on a Saturday morning and one game on a Sunday morning. So they offered us a cottage on a beautiful lake for like $50 for 2 nights.
Oh, God. Wow.
So here we come. The only downside was most of my players didn't want to go. I had to makeshift a team together to try to go, and I had to come up with a couple of extra players, which is what I did. I had Joe Pascuzzo, who was only 15 at the time, and never lets me forget that I didn't let him play Senior Babe Ruth that year because of his age.
Right.
I finally said, come on, can you go? So I had to get permission from his dad to take him. So
right.
Joe Pascuzzo, and then I had also had Steve Allen, who had played on the high school team.
Right.
But he was not part that year of my team, so he came with us. So we had only 10 guys in 2 vehicles. And so I had a truck with a cabin truck, which Steve Allen then had.
Right.
So I had a cabin truck with players in there, and then I had my car, and the rest of the team was in my car. So, and we had to make our way to Maine.
That was the days, too, of not having air conditioners in cars either. So that had to be really...
Well, it all began, the chaos begins, because they all somehow convinced me that it would have been okay to have a few beers.
Oh, wow.
For the lake, for the cottage on the lake between games. And, they made a cogent argument to me that, well, it's all legal. They're all, most of them were 18, and
right.
We're not going to drive. We're not going to do it during before or after games. It's just, a few beers.
Right.
So we stopped at a place next to the old Wawa's, which is now Krauser's, I believe, or something else.
Right.
On Route 34 in Derby, and lo and behold, when they came out of the store, they had hand trucks.
Oh, God. So It wasn't just a few then.
It was hand trucks, and I remember Roy Garfalo trying to convince me that this was a few.
Right.
And they needed something to sit on in the back of the truck, which that was the great logic. But in the end, so we started out for Maine, and they had all promised not to drink. But yet they wanted to stop every 20 minutes.
To drink, right.
No, to go to the bathroom.
Oh, so where that ended.
Yeah. So that's some of the anecdotes you'll see in there talk about that whole saga.
Right.
And when we got to the intersection with the Massachusetts Turnpike, they didn't follow me towards Maine.
Oh, God.
The truck behind me took the wrong exit and went on the Mass Pike West, which led them to Springfield.
Oh, Jesus.
So I'm heading to Maine on a Friday night, and they're heading to Springfield on a Friday night. We had to meet up in the middle of Maine and then play a game the next morning at 10:30.
Oh, my God. And, there were no cell phones then, so nobody could call and say, we got lost or anything like that.
Well, believe it or not, the other truck had a CB radio. Back then, CB radios were very popular. I had one in my car. He had one in his truck.
Right.
And I tried frantically to raise them on the CB radio, but for some reason they didn't decide to turn it on.
Oh, man. So now you're 21 years old, and, you're going to a trip like this to Maine, and, you're talking about how they convinced you to stop for a few, to get... Let me ask you this. I mean, as a 21-year-old kid, I mean, you're still, you're an adult, but you're still kind of a kid. Were you nervous throughout this whole trip? I mean, we're
deathly fearful.
Yes. Right.
Yeah, my biggest fear. That's one of the
Did
reasons.
you regret making the trip at first?
Initially, yeah, there was a lot of yelling and screaming.
Right.
It was, but they were just that kind of group. They just, you couldn't stay mad at them long.
Right. So talk about all the adventures in Maine, but talk about competing in Maine. How did you guys do, during that tournament?
Well, let me put it this way. We showed up in our cottage about 3:30 in the morning.
Right.
We got up, and the Maine coach was so magnanimous. I mean, he was such a great guy. He fed us pancakes, and, he really
nice.
fed us in the morning,
Right.
And we played the game at 10:30, and we won. We beat the Maine state champions the first game.
Oh, wow. Nice.
Pat McCormick was on the mound. Roy Garfalo at first base.
Right.
Russ Scovin at second. Bobby Gabinelli at short. And Joe Pascuzzo, who got really criticized the whole game by the other team because I did not have a pair of uniform pants for him.
Right.
So, and then I had McCormick pitched, Wasikowska caught, and Mike Dobeck was in left field.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And in center field was Bill Schwab, who was injured that entire weekend. He couldn't swing a bat.
Right.
And I had Jocko Viette in right field.
Right. And of course, Jocko would eventually become your brother-in-law.
Right.
And
right.
Yeah, Jocko's a character too.
Yeah.
We know the Jocko-isms. But let me ask you this now. I'm trying to think. Correct me if I'm wrong. Did you have Dave Mikas on that team, or?
No. He played the year before, I believe.
Right.
But not in 77.
Right. Now, he was on the 77 team.
Correct.
The championship team. But
yeah, he was a pretty integral part of that. He was like their first sub, or whatever. He played third base, second base. He was pretty much a utility player, but he could play in a couple of positions. But I don't believe Dave made the trip.
Right.
He wasn't on the team then.
And it sounds like you really didn't have many people helping you coach this team. You kind of had to go at it alone. Is that correct?
Well, in 76, I had Anthony Brusciati, who was Rich Brusciati's brother, because Rich Brusciati was on the team. He was one of the players. His brother helped me out in 76. 77, he might have been there somewhat. I think he was for most of the season. But he didn't take the trip, no.
Right.
So I was on my own.
Right.
I was on my own, literally.
Now, talk about, you touched on him briefly before. Talk about Dave the Nud DeRosa, because it sounds like he's a big part of this book, and there's a lot of great stories. So just, talk to us about him in general.
Well, Dave was a character who loved the game of baseball, and he was the easiest guy to coach, and he was talented.
Right.
And he was the captain, one of the captains of the 77 state title team, him along with Gary Bajsadecki, and I want to say Ed Wasikowska, I believe.
Right.
So, but Dave was just a baseball player who really thought well on his feet. I mean, he was a student of the game, and he knew exactly what he wanted to do, and they were a very, very determined bunch of kids.
Right.
But I can tell you, in 77, Dave had a time where we were playing a game, and I do mention this in the book. We were playing a game in Wolcott in a free tournament, and that's all I had to hear was the word free, and we're going.
Right.
So we were playing in the game, and it was getting dark, and we were ahead, and the other team, the umpire wanted to basically allow the other team to come back, even though it was totally dark out.
Right.
Well, the game actually ends on a ground ball to Bill Schwab at third, who throws it to DeRosa at first, who played first base a little bit for me.
Right.
And he throws the ball a good 10 to 20 feet over DeRosa's head. And DeRosa actually fakes a catch.
Oh, wow.
And
really?
convinces the umpire that he caught the final out, and so the game ended.
So the ump gave you the call?
No, the ump just called him out, and we ran off the field, and then finally...
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so Dave had that presence, which you never would find.
That's pretty smart. I've seen stranger plays, the hidden ball trick and stuff.
Yeah.
But that one, that's really thinking on your feet. Wow.
So what happened was they discovered, after we got in our cars, and it was totally pitch black, they came running up saying, we found the baseball in right field. So I was like, what are you going to do now? So in the end, the umpire decided to cancel the game, obviously, because it was so dark.
Right.
But then our argument was that it reverted back to the prior inning, so we win.
Right. So what ended up happening?
Oh, what ended up happening was you got thrown out of their tournament.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they didn't come back.
Now, let me ask you, was the other team, did they see the ball get overthrown? No. So they didn't even pay attention? Huh?
No, because it was on our side of the field.
Right.
Our side of the dugout.
That is crazy. That's one of the best stories you could tell. I mean, right there alone tells you, I mean, you want that kid on the field. If he's, got enough presence to think of that. I mean, that's a classic story.
I mean, he just like snapped his glove hand and then put up his arms like, yeah, we won. And then he came running over to congratulate the pitcher. And we all huddled and then ran off the field.
Right.
And wanted to get out of there as soon as we could.
That's crazy. I mean, now let me ask you, be honest, did you think it was an out? Did you ever see it go to right field?
Oh, I saw Covers.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
So you just played dumb and
Yeah, I was like, this is. But see, I was so angry that he had not canceled the game earlier because it was really, really dark.
Right.
And the umpire was just allowing the game. The street lights were on already. Cars had their headlights on. You know, it was one of those things where it was like ridiculous to keep playing.
Right.
And it proved to be true because they couldn't even see a ball go over a first baseman's head.
Wow, that's a crazy story.
So, yeah, that was Nud. So that's the kind of player he was, is that he wanted to win and he knew the game and he could be tricky like that. Yeah, he's a great kid.
Right. Now, Ed Wasikowska, I'd always heard stories that when he would pitch, he would kind of talk to the batter and stuff like that, try to get in his head a little bit. Talk about Ed just as a, player.
Ed was another very, very tough competitor on the team, which was filled with competitors.
Right.
And Ed his hero was Mark the Bird Friedrich, who was the Rookie of the Year for the Detroit Tigers back then. And so Ed used to manicure the mound. He used to talk to the ball.
Right.
He used to sometimes aim the ball, as if he
inside. Yeah.
Yeah, as if he was aiming it to a spot on home plate or so. And then he would go into this trance sometimes behind the mound and then bang his glove and walk up to the rubber and pitch.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Did that quite often. And so it would be kind of a psych out. And in the 77 final game at Quigley Stadium, if you see, there's a picture on one of the old newspaper in the Valley, which is still available out there. You see a picture of Ed going into a trance after the final out with his arms up in the air. Yeah. And he had made an error in the final inning himself. There was the final out should have been a ground ball back to the mound.
Right.
But he overthrew the first baseman.
Oh, wow.
But he didn't get unnerved, and he got the next out on I believe it was a fly ball to George Russo, who was playing right field at the time.
Right. Yeah. That's what I was going to ask you. Would he get unnerved at all? I mean, if it wasn't going good, would he lose focus? Or
no, not Ed. He just always kept going and going and going. And he ended up pitching 4 years for Northeastern on a scholarship, so in Division I baseball.
What I remember about him is he used to play in the softball league on PYMC.
Yeah.
And he was a good hitter. He used to put the ball over the fence a lot. Yeah. Was he a good hitter, too?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So his hitting was just as good as his pitching.
Oh, correct? Absolutely. Yeah, Ed was, you had, that team was an extremely powerful hitting team. I mean, Gary Bystecki, for example, at first base in 1977 was only one of two players to ever hit the Derby High School's clubhouse in center field.
Right.
So he's one of the two, the other being George Busnack, who was in the Hall of Fame of Derby Athletics.
And George was like a three-sport athlete, great player.
Yeah, so you had a fantastic hitting team that year. McCormick was a great hitter, and then even everybody else filling it out were good. I mean, that was a phenomenal team. Right,
and how many games that whole summer would you say you guys probably played? And I mean, did you play double headers a lot too?
Once in a while. I took the team to go to Bethlehem, I talked about in the other book. We used to go to Bethlehem, and play double headers against Bethlehem. So we would take a team once in a while. We would play double headers, but they probably played. We were in the tournament that year in the state of Connecticut. And we ended up we were one of the final four teams that year in Connecticut in Senior Babe Ruth. So I would estimate we played about somewhere between 25 and 30 games.
Right. And I bet, you're young then and you're a competitor, you want to win, but I bet even when you guys lost, you just had so much fun coaching these guys that sometimes, the losses didn't even really stand out to you because you're with these guys all the time and you're just having fun doing it.
Yeah, I think we only lost besides losing that one game in Maine, we lost the second half of that doubleheader by 1 run.
Right.
We had only lost 3 games during the entire year.
Right.
So it wasn't one of those things that was a regular happening. We didn't lose very often. When we did, there was kids were really upset about it. They didn't want to lose.
Right.
And that was part of their image. I mean, that's the way they were. They did not want to lose. To them, they were state champions, especially in '77. They did not want to lose.
Exactly. Now, would Coach Fay make any of the trips? Would he come up and watch you guys play? And
once in a great while. Tom was the one that started the Senior Babe Ruth program in Derby. So he started it in 1976, which I actually played on the team. So I was a player coach in '76. So I think he started it perhaps in '75. I'm not sure, but he started it right around there. And I was a player, and then I became a player coach with him with about 3 of my other friends who played on the 1973 team.
Right.
They helped, so we were a quad coaching staff for 1 year, and then the next year I was alone with Butch Bisciotti.
Right.
So Tom was an instrumental part of creating that, because there never was any place to play in Derby in the summer for anybody out of high school.
Right. There was no Legion yet,
no,
correct?
No.
Right. So now, talk to me about McCormick and Wasikowska. I mean, you said when one pitched, the other caught. I mean, did the two get along good? I mean, would they argue at all? Like, as far as what they were calling and things like that?
No, I never experienced that with them. They were, for the most part, in sync. The only thing I had to really control was the catcher, whoever was catching, would say, I want to pitch.
Right.
Like, put me in now.
Yeah.
That was the only thing, is that there were times where I had to decide whether to take that pitcher out and flip-flop. And so you had to be, I would say I had to be careful to do it at the right time.
Right.
Because they were such competitors. So it didn't happen very often.
Right.
It didn't happen very often. Once in a great while, they would need some relief.
Right. So now you're writing this book, and again, it looks like you started it a little bit in 2005, and you really got it going, after you had mentioned the unfortunate passing of Ed. But would you talk to former players about, like, kind of recounting some events, or did you just remember all this very well?
No, I did talk to some players. Dave DeRosa, DeRosa didn't go, so he didn't. He regrets it to this day that he didn't go. He constantly reminds me that. I talked to Jocko, obviously. Talked to Steve Allen.
Right.
So I was able to talk to him. I wasn't able to talk to Billy Schwab or some of the others, but there was a couple other guys I remember I did talk to them about it, what they might have recalled from that event.
Right.
And many of them I've forgotten, majority of it, except for a few incidences.
Right.
Yeah, it's very difficult to go back that far. It's almost 40. It'll be 40 years this year.
Right, which is crazy. And I think that's cool that, the book's coming out now kind of, culminates into the anniversary and stuff. Now, is there a plan for some of the former players and yourself to do a Q&A somewhere and kind of...
Well, I can try. I'm going to certainly try to do that. I know I have the Derby Public Library has...
right.
I have an event coming up in January with them.
Right.
I'm certainly going to try to see how many players might be willing to come back and talk about it. But Dave DeRosa, for example, Nud in the book is in California.
Right.
But there are some that are still around. Russ Govan, who played, is still around. He went on that trip. Bobby Gabinelli is still around. There's a few of them that I've been able to have some contact with. But obviously, I talk to them quite often, and usually we reminisce about the loss of the 2 young men, which was very difficult. Pat McCormick died about 15 years ago.
Right, right.
And then Ed last year.
Right. Now, kind of talk about the difference in writing the 2 books, The Fat Lady Never Sings and then The Lord of the Infield Flies. I mean, what was the difference in writing one as, opposed to the other? Well,
The Fat Lady Never Sings had a lot more background information to introduce the readers into the Derby mindset, so to speak, about sports. And it's a much longer book, obviously, because I'm only talking in the Fat Lady Never Sings is about eras of baseball, whereas The Lord of the Infield Flies is about one specific time frame in 77. So The Lord of the Infield Flies is a prequel, so to speak, of the beginnings of how Derby baseball came about and how it started to flourish.
Right.
And it started in the 70s. So it's a much different task because of the amount of time that the era that I'm covering.
Right.
And the challenge was in The Lord of the Infield Flies is to have an entire book talk about one weekend.
Right. That is crazy when you think about it.
So it's like I'm making an entire book out of a one weekend trip, which, so that was a bigger challenge.
Right. How did you feel when this book was published, though? I mean, was it more relief than, gratification? I mean, I'm sure you were definitely, proud of it and stuff like that. But sometimes when you're writing a book that long and you said you go back to your editor and he's telling you, nope, this isn't right, or you're just not understanding me. I mean, is it more relief, or did you, once it was done, were you able to, take it in and say, you know what, I'm proud that I did this?
Well, you don't really get that until you see the actual physical book.
Right.
Once I was able to crack open that first box of books that I got shipped, then that's where the pride of what you're doing comes into play. Prior to that, you deal with it so much, you literally, after a while, just don't want to look at it anymore.
Right.
Because you're constantly being told something you had to do. For example, in The Lord of the Infield Flies, there was a quotation mark on the back cover that was not there. So we had to redo a lot of things to do it again.
Right.
So you get frustrated when, and then the spine of the book, there was a word missing. So I found that out later. So you had to keep going back and going back.
Right.
So, but no, you get a sense of pride when you finish it. But then there's that time period before it comes out where you're just tired of hearing about the issues dealing with it.
Right.
And then it comes back again. You come full circle when you see the actual physical book.
Right.
But in this case, it's a story that I wanted to tell because of the nature of those kids and the fact that these kinds of stories will be lost.
Right.
There's some stories that we only learn through telling each other them. You don't see them in a newspaper or or a magazine or on a radio or TV. There's things that you want to pass these on, so that some people know how competitive these kids were, and how much fun they had. I mean, they were like a fun-loving group of guys, and and that the goal now is that all the proceeds of the book are going to a scholarship fund, which was created with the Valley Community Foundation.
Right.
And it was started by Tim Conlon, who
wrote a few books
wrote a few books himself.
Yeah.
And he was a close friend of Ed Wasikowski. So this past summer, he started they had a fundraiser for his scholarship fund in his name.
Right.
At the Picnic Grove in Derby. So that raised some money. And what I'm trying to do now is see if I can add to that.
Right. And I believe Ed passed in the spring of 2015.
Yeah.
So right after that is when you got cracking on the book?
Yeah.
So pretty much, 15 months it took you to kind of complete it.
Yeah.
Give or take. Now, when did you actually finish the book, would you say? Where you finally said, okay, this is going to the editor?
I would say sometime about 3 months ago.
3 months ago, yeah. So
well, more than that. Well, yeah, about 3 months ago, I'd have to say. Yeah, the editing process took about 2 months, and I was trying to push it.
Right.
I was actually trying to complete it before the World Series, but I couldn't.
Right. Yeah. And let's just talk about this a little bit. What would you say, in your honest opinion, this book, where does it rank? You've done 2 books. You don't want to ever pick one over the other, but this is your second one now. You don't ever want to rest on your laurels. You want to prove that you could do it a second time around. So where would this one rank as far as things you've done in your life? Because you've done so much, won championships, wrote a book already, successful law firm and things like that. So where would this rank as far as?
Oh, it ranks up there. I mean, it's I'm very proud of that book because of the fact that it tells a story about some fantastic young kids.
Right.
When I write the books, I don't really look at it as something that's for me. I look at it as something for the people that would read it. I mean, obviously I want to do it. It's because, but many a times I'm doing it because nobody else is.
Right.
It's like I'm hoping that somebody else tells a story.
Right.
That one, The Fat Lady Never Sings, would have been very difficult. Excuse me, for anybody else to write, obviously, because it was a weekend that we were all
and
together.
D wasn't going to remember everything. So
well, John D is, I mentioned him also in the book because he actually used to go to some of our games,
right?
And that's how our relationship began. Is that he would go to some of the games, and I remember we played in a regional final that year, that summer, and John D was there with Joe Pascuso, who was still reminding me that he should be on the field.
And D was a lot younger then, so you can only imagine what he was, like back then. He was probably, a lot more aggressive as far as, yelling and,
Well, he was very close to these players because he was the freshman coach that year in '77, and there's a unique, very, very unique picture that's out there of John running out of the dugout with his hands up in the air, happy for these kids.
Right.
So John was like an enthusiastic freshman coach back then, who, helped out that team. So along with Norm Mittendorf, who was the JV coach back then.
Norm coached a lot in the 70s, basketball and baseball.
Yeah, and then
I
Tom,
think he even
obviously
did cross country a little bit, helped Ken Marcuscio, things of that nature. What story is fascinating, and I can't really wait to read it, is the Eden lobster that you put in there. You want to touch a little bit on that, or just like a little appetizer?
A little bit. I mean, what happened was the coach from the other team had, I knew that Maine lobster was always talked about. So I asked the coach if there was any particular places that he knew of, and he knew a few. So he said, okay, let's go to this one place. So I gave the players the option. They can either stay in Old Orchard Beach, which was a resort town,
right,
or they can come with me and the other coach to go to eat lobster.
Right.
And I didn't win out. The only players that went with me, with the coach, believe it or not, were Ed Wasikowska, who always knew a good lobster when he saw one, and Jocko Viet.
Oh, so two people. Wow. That had to be something unique for sure.
Yeah. The rest of the team was back at Old Orchard Beach, which is another thing that I regretted, leaving them back there.
Right. Now, has anybody read the book from that team yet? Have any of them viewed it yet? Has the book went out in stores yet? I mean, I know last time you put it out in some of the local stores in the Valley.
Well, this time I decided to get it out at Blanchette's Sporting Goods. They've been a big supporter of Valley sports, and for my books, and for the cause. I mean, so I wanted to have the book out there first, and then it's going to be up on Amazon in about 2 or 3 days.
2 or 3 days.
Yeah. But the initial thing of the book, I wanted it to be out in Blanchette Sporting Goods to be able to have people go get the physical book right away. And it'll also be, I'll try to place it in other similar places I did last time. Right.
Now, have you talked to Ed's wife?
Oh, constantly.
Yeah. I'm sure she's gotten a copy already.
She's very happy about it. Yeah.
Right. It's a great tribute to him. Not a lot of people, if you're not aware who Ed Wasikowska was, I mean, he was a Derby graduate. He was a very good football and baseball player for Derby. And as I alluded to earlier, he played on those PYMC softball teams for years, and he was such a great hitter. It looked like he was always hitting a home run every time he was up. He was also, an official for years. He refereed a lot of biddy basketball. I believe he umpired too a little bit. And he was really a great guy. I mean, he was a character, but he was a good-hearted person, never a mean guy, just like, a character. He said what was on his mind.
He absolutely did.
Right.
And then on top of it, his daughter, Carissa, still plays for for Southern Connecticut. She was an all-state softball player at Seymour High.
Right.
Played on a state championship team herself.
Yes. Yeah.
And now plays.
She was a very fast kid. Yeah.
Still plays for Southern Connecticut. So I think this is going to be her senior year, if I'm not mistaken.
Right. Now, we've always talked forever, and sometimes, we joke about it, but we've always said, is there ever going to be a movie for The Fat Lady Never Sings? Well, I don't know if that'll ever happen, but looking at the characters in this book, there has to be a movie down the road. I mean, can you see that ever happening someday?
Well, maybe not in my lifetime, but hopefully,
I think it would, definitely be great to get it out there. And
I've got it out. The books also, what I do is I send the books out to try to get them in certain contests. So the book's going to be entered into various contests out there for books, including cover and including the interior, so and the story itself. But
right.
The main reason to write it is different. But on the same token, I'm trying to get the word out there as much as possible to get more donations back to the foundation.
Right. So now the book is definitely out at Blanchette's as we speak.
Absolutely. Yep.
Right.
Yeah.
And the book came out, last week, I believe?
Last week, yeah.
Right. So now here's the final question. Is this it for Steve Reilly as far as writing books, or do you have one more in you?
Well, I think I have a couple more in me. The
I think you got to write about those great Seymour teams and coaching with Bob Kello. I think that would be awesome.
That's another.
Yeah.
That's another. Those are another bunch of stories. That's the great part about baseball is that no matter all these kids that you coach, they're always unique and they're always that's the thing I love about them.
Yeah.
But and then my good friend Bobby Calsavage over there at Blanchette's is trying to get me to write a book about just growing up in Derby. What it was like.
That would be fascinating. I mean, It was a great time, especially the era you grew up in. I mean, especially sports-wise, Derby was at its, but even the basketball team was good back then in the 70s,
And it's the era of Vietnam.
Honestly, Steve, I think you could write a whole book about Jocko and nobody would get bored. I think you could tell so many stories, just about Jocko alone, and people would read it. But,
but I couldn't do that to Jocko.
Right.
It's, he's a very fun-loving guy.
Right.
Who was just the first Frenchman to ever be elected as the president of the American Marquesjan Club.
Yeah.
In Derby. So. He's just a great
long-time
guy,
official too. He's been,
still does football.
Yep, he's been doing football forever. I remember him doing it 25 years ago, and he's, still doing it. So this isn't it for Steve Reilly as far as writing. You're going to continue to write.
No, I'll continue to write, especially as I get even older.
Right.
Once I can stop hitting fly balls and ground balls to kids.
Right. So now we talked about a Q&A. Are you going to be at any other places? I do know when you did the Fat Lady Never Sings, you talked with George DeMayo.
I'll probably end up trying to reach out to them to do that as well. I know I'm doing the Rotary Club circuit, so to speak, and then I'll do some other venues or whatever venues I can find.
Right.
Yeah, I'm trying to get the memory of these guys to be out there.
Steve, one of the things that's happened over the last 20 years is a lot of history has been erased in all the sports, and schools in general. It's just the tradition hasn't been there like it once was. So I think it's great that you wrote this book, The Fat Lady Never Sings. You told the story about these great players, and, people got to hear about them. Otherwise, they'd have no idea who they were. Yeah. And I think doing this, the Lord of the Infield Flies is just awesome because you're talking about a group of young kids who were, in the final stages of their high school career. Yeah. Just having a weekend fun playing baseball, which is really what it's all about. So I really think that's the most important thing is you're kind of giving them, a little positive press, and I think that's just awesome.
Yeah, well, that's what I was trying to do. Now, it's avenues such as this, such as the Valley Independent Sentinel, are keeping that alive.
Right.
And that's really what's great about it. And that's why so many people look on your website, is that because of that fact that the Valley is kept alive that way. And they can learn about what goes on in the Valley, which in the past was with the namesake, the Sentinel. And And one of the things that was a great avenue of looking back at sports is to be able to see the archives of the Sentinel, which you can see at the Derby Public Library, Seymour Public Library.
Still there.
Yeah, it's still there.
Which is great.
Yeah.
There's not, when they took that away, that was, a rough day in the Valley, but
it's keeping these stories alive, and I'm sure that there's a lot more stories out there about kids that played for, Ansonia, Shelton, Seymour, or whatever. And my hope is that somebody else comes and picks up the mantle to write a story about other kids.
Right. Well, whether they do or not, I don't know if they could do it as good a justice as you have, but I really do applaud you for doing these books. I think they're awesome. I to this day could still read The Fat Lady Never Sings. I'll just go into a certain chapter and read about it. You never get tired of it, and I just think this book's going to be great. I could just see already. I can't wait to read about the lobster story. That's going to be great. So I really think what you're doing is great, and I really appreciate you coming on today, and I think this book's going to be great.
Well, thanks for the kind words, Mike, and I'm happy to be here, and thanks again.
And that's Steve Reilly, and again, he is the new author of The Lord of the Infield Flies. You could get it at Blanchette Sporting Goods stores. He will be making a couple appearances, and details to follow with that. For Valley Sports Rewind, I'm Mike Cannici saying goodbye, everyone.